This is Middletown, Pennsylvania. From its quaint main street to suburban homes with backyard pools and white picket fences to its oversized high school football stadium, it is, in every conceivable way, the quintessential American small town. But beneath the surface, it has far more in common with a town like Pripyat, Ukraine, home to Chernobyl, than Lake Placid, New York, or Whitefish, Montana. That's because, in the early morning hours of March 28, 1979, a jammed valve and cascade of errors and design faults at the nearby 3 Mile Island nuclear generating station led to the worst nuclear disaster that America has ever seen. What followed was a botched government response and alleged cover-up by the utility that led to widespread panic, the evacuation of 140,000 people, fuel for America's burgeoning anti-nuclear movement, and the derailment of America's entire nuclear industry. And yet, if it weren't for a single commemorative plaque at the disaster site, you never realize its dark history. This is a story of how sometimes the real disaster is how we overreact. This is the story of 3 Mile Island. To understand 3 Mile Island, one must first understand the history of nuclear power and the anti-nuclear movement in the US. That history began on August 1st, 1946, when President Truman signed the Atomic Energy Act into law, paving the way for the peaceful use of nuclear technology. Scientists at the Argonne and Idaho National Laboratories immediately took advantage of this newfound freedom. In 1951, nuclear reactor EBR-1 became the first to successfully provide electricity, powering 4 100-watt light bulbs. Just days later, it powered the entire lab. Scientists quickly saw its promise. Just 1 ton of uranium could provide enough electricity to power 2.3 million light bulbs for a year, making it 16,000 times more efficient than coal and 80,000 times more efficient than oil. A cheap, safe, clean, and near limitless source of electricity, once only dreamt of by kooky sci-fi writers and mad scientists, had just become a reality, and the country's first commercial nuclear power plant soon opened at Shippingport, Pennsylvania in 1957. Shippingport, like most US reactors that followed it, relied on an incredibly simple piece of technology known as a pressurized water reactor, or PWR. PWRs work by pumping cold coolant water around a nuclear reactor, heating it up. The water is then pumped by a steam generator, which as the name suggests, is used to create steam and force it through a turbine, spinning it, and thus generating electricity. If you think this looks similar to any other power plant, you'd be right. In fact, it's nearly identical. The only difference is that the heat is generated via nuclear fission instead of, for example, burning coal or oil. With this simple tech and the promise of endless electricity, America quickly became addicted. By the mid-70s, over 50 were in operation, including at 3 Mile Island, which opened its first reactor in 1974. Throughout it all, this construction boom enjoyed the broad support of the American people. A Department of Energy study found that, in the 70s, just 28% of Americans opposed nuclear power plant construction. What little opposition did exist was mostly confined to small environmental groups and hippies, never once obtaining widespread success at the ballot box. But, on March 28, 1979, decades of public support and technological development would all come crashing down in mere hours. That morning, at almost exactly 4 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, a small amount of coolant water found its way into an airline. This minor incident led to a cascading series of faults and ultimately the meltdown of the reactor core. Almost immediately, it triggered a shutdown of the feed water and condensate pumps. Within seconds, water flow to and from the steam generator was stopped, shutting down the turbine. This prevented heat from transferring out of the reactor core, causing its temperature and pressure to rise rapidly. Just 8 seconds after the turbine shut off, the pressure set point of 2325 psi was hit, triggering an emergency shutdown of the reactor. However, a combination of fatal design flaws and human error made this ineffective. First, the reactor continued to generate some heat, further raising its temperature. Second, the block valve was jammed closed, preventing backup coolant water from reaching the reactor. Now, this could have been opened manually, but operators failed to notice the warning lights as they were covered with sticky notes. And finally, what little water did make it through the reactor was lost within 15 seconds when the relief valve got jammed open, slowly causing the leftover coolant water to drain from the system. With all safety systems shut down, the reactor continued to get hotter and hotter, and Middletown, Pennsylvania was quickly becoming the epicenter of a looming nuclear meltdown. Over the next few hours, the reactor temperature continued to rise, but operators would fail to properly address the growing disaster. Finally, at 6:45 a.m., nearly 3 full hours after the incident began, radiation alarms went off and an emergency was declared. But by that point, the damage had already been done. The reactor core had partially melted, releasing radiation into the coolant water stream and surrounding air. According to nearby Geiger counters, these radiation levels were 300 times higher than normal. The reactor containment building, a concrete structure enclosing the reactor, was the only thing keeping the radiation inside. If it were to be breached, the resulting fallout could poison the air and drinking water of millions, directly and indirectly kill thousands, and leave the surrounding territory uninhabitable for hundreds of generations. Or could it? If you were an engineer, especially with the benefit of hindsight, the answer was a resounding no. The containment structure was never at major risk of being breached, and even if it had been, the radiation levels were orders of magnitude lower than Chernobyl. But if you were a resident of Middletown, Pennsylvania, or a surrounding community, the answer was a resounding yes. This discrepancy owes to a breakdown in communication between Met-Ed, the utility, and state and federal officials. The first public statement came later that morning from Pennsylvania's Lieutenant Governor William Scranton III, who, based on the information provided to him from Met-Ed, opted to reassure the public that there was little risk. However, within hours, the state government began to fear that Met-Ed was withholding information about the incident's severity, and their trust with each other quickly deteriorated. Later that day, Scranton recanted his statement, closed schools, and ordered residents to stay inside. And by the next morning, a partial evacuation was recommended, which saw over 100,000 residents flee the area. These contradictory messages quickly incited panic and fear in local residents. At the same time, news that an off-site detector had picked up traces of radiation hit the presses. Despite the fact that levels were far too low to pose any health hazard and were primarily made up of non-hazardous noble gases, news agencies did not hesitate to release sensationalist headlines. Meanwhile, on April 1st, 4 days after the accident, President Jimmy Carter visited the site. He came out of the visit confident that the accident posed little danger, but declined to say so publicly to avoid angering anti-nuclear Democrats. Within a week, the acute danger was over, and long, tedious, but ultimately low-risk cleanup work could start. According to subsequent investigations, the average local resident's radiation exposure was the equivalent to just a single chest X-ray. But, thanks to the disastrous, panic-inducing public response, the political fallout had only just begun. For America's anti-nuclear movement, 3 Mile Island was like kerosene poured on an open fire. Within weeks, an anti-nuclear rally drew thousands of protesters at nearby Harrisburg, and soon after, the movement caught the attention of the nation. The next month, California Governor Jerry Brown joined 65,000 protesters in Washington. By September, celebrities like Jane Fonda and Ralph Nader were giving speeches in front of 200,000 in New York. And, for the first time, the general public was turning against nuclear power as well. The same Department of Energy study that I referenced earlier now found that 44% of Americans oppose nuclear power, an increase of 16%. Meanwhile, a Gallup poll found that 60% of Americans would oppose the construction of a plant within 5 miles of their homes, a 15% increase from before the accident. The impact on the nuclear energy industry in the US was immediate. In every year from 1980 to 1989, the number of reactors under construction declined, with nearly 60% of approved reactor constructions being canceled by utilities or regulators, and no new approvals being issued from 1980 to 2012. What once was an industry seeping in promise had been relegated to the sidelines. And, as is usually the case in the aftermath of anti-nuclear movements, its lost potential was made up for with dirty, polluting sources like coal and natural gas, instead of clean energy like wind and solar. This, to me, is the true disaster of 3 Mile Island. If we really want to fight climate change, nuclear energy must be a part of it. According to the US Department of Energy, every single year, nuclear power saves us from 470 million tons of carbon emissions. That's equivalent to taking 100 million cars off the road. At the same time, according to Our World in Data, nuclear power results in 350 times fewer deaths than coal and 40 times fewer than natural gas. If 3 Mile Island should teach us anything, it's the importance of maintaining public trust during a disaster. Between politicians and journalists exaggerating the risk for personal gain, or MetEd's terrible communication, the incident broke public trust in what is, to date, one of the safest and cleanest forms of energy creation that humans have ever discovered. And so, if 3 Mile Island is remembered for anything, it certainly should not be as a tragedy or disaster of epic proportions, but rather as one of lost potential, and a sobering reminder of just what can be lost when the people we entrust to keep us safe don't do their duty.